A Portuguese admiral stands on the deck of his flagship in the Red Sea, watching thousands of Muslim pilgrims crowd the shores of Jeddah. It's 1513, and Hajj season is in full swing. He turns to his officers and says something that would make even hardened crusaders pause. "We sail for Mecca. We will tear down their temple stone by stone," while they pray. This wasn't some drunken fantasy. The admiral had 16 warships, 2,000 soldiers armed with cannons and firearms, and explicit orders from the King of Portugal himself. The plan was simple and utterly horrifying. Attack Mecca during the holiest week of the Islamic calendar, slaughter the pilgrims and demolish the Kaaba. Not damage it, not desecrate it. Completely destroy the most sacred site in Islam, while hundreds of thousands of Muslims performed their religious duty. And they almost pulled it off. This isn't a what-if scenario from alternative history. This was a real military operation that came within days of execution. The only reason you haven't heard about it is because what actually stopped them is somehow even crazier than the plan itself. Before we dive into one of the most audacious military operations in history, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths that challenge our sanitized understanding of the past, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from, especially if this story is new to you. This is the story of how Portugal, a nation smaller than Indiana, nearly destroyed Islam's holiest site and changed the course of world history. And it starts with a man who makes modern military hardliners look like peacekeepers. We need to stop and correct a massive misconception about the Age of Discovery. When you learned about Portuguese explorers in school, you probably heard about brave sailors seeking spices and trade routes, Vasco da Gama sailing around Africa, Prince Henry the Navigator dreaming of maritime glory. It all sounds so civilized, entrepreneurial even. That's horseshit. The Portuguese weren't exploring. They were waging a religious war of annihilation across 3 continents. And the man who embodied this crusader mentality more than anyone else was Afonso de Albuquerque, the governor of Portuguese India from 1509 to 1515. Albuquerque wasn't an explorer. He was a holy warrior with Renaissance military technology and an Old Testament worldview. Imagine a medieval crusader who got his hands on cannons. And you're starting to understand this man. Born in 1453, the same year Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, Albuquerque grew up in a Portugal still defined by 8 centuries of religious warfare against Muslim kingdoms. His father had fought in the final campaigns of the Reconquista. His uncle had sailed with Vasco da Gama's first voyage around Africa. War against Islam wasn't just his profession, it was his inheritance. He conquered Goa in 1510 by deliberately timing his assault during Hindu festivals, so he could massacre Muslims while they were distracted. When he took the city, he didn't just kill enemy soldiers. His orders were explicit: kill every Muslim, all of them, men, women, children. If they pray toward Mecca, they die. The chroniclers record that his troops spent 3 days doing exactly that. They went house to house, mosque to mosque, killing every Muslim they could find. The Portuguese soldiers dragged families from their homes, they threw children off rooftops, they burned people alive in their own houses. The Mandovi River that runs through Goa reportedly ran red with blood for days after the massacre. Bodies were stacked in the streets so high that carts couldn't pass through. The chroniclers don't record these details with horror, they record them with pride. Portuguese accounts describe Albuquerque walking through the carnage, inspecting the bodies, making sure his orders were being followed to the letter. When a Portuguese soldier was caught hiding a Muslim woman to save her life, Albuquerque had both of them executed publicly as examples. This wasn't the fog of war or soldiers getting out of control. This was policy, methodical, systematic, pre-planned. Then he burned down every single mosque in Goa, not because they were military targets, because he wanted to erase Islam from India entirely. He forced Hindu widows to marry Portuguese soldiers, deliberately trying to breed out local populations. He cut off the noses and ears of spice traders who sold to anyone but Portugal. He poisoned wells. He crucified prisoners on the beaches as warnings. And here's what you need to understand about Albuquerque. None of this was considered excessive by his contemporaries in Lisbon. King Manuel I of Portugal read the reports of these atrocities and promoted him. The church celebrated him, because Portugal wasn't running a business venture in the Indian Ocean. They were running a crusade. The Portuguese strategy in Asia had 3 goals, and only one of them was economic. First, monopolize the spice trade by any means necessary. Second, find the mythical Christian kingdom of Prester John somewhere in Africa or Asia to ally with. Third, and this is the one that explains everything, destroy Islam completely. Not defeat it, not contain it, destroy it. Let's talk about the spice trade for a moment, because this is where economics and religious warfare become inseparable. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, mace, These spices were worth more than gold in 16th century Europe. A single ship's cargo of quality pepper could make its investors rich for life. The problem was that every one of these spices came from Asia, and every traditional trade route from Asia to Europe went through Muslim-controlled territory. The traditional route looked like this. Spices grown in Indonesia and India, shipped to ports like Calicut or Malacca, sold to Arab merchants, transported across the Indian Ocean to Aden or Hormuz, carried overland through Ottoman or Persian territory to Alexandria or Constantinople, sold to Venetian or Genoese merchants, distributed throughout Europe. At each step, someone took a cut. By the time spices reached European markets, they cost 50 to 100 times what they cost at the source. By the time spices reached European markets, they cost 50 to 100 times what they cost at the source. The Portuguese wanted to cut out every single middleman, not negotiate with them, not compete with them, eliminate them entirely. Vasco da Gama's voyage around Africa in 1498 proved it was possible to reach India by sea, bypassing all Muslim-controlled territory. But proving something was possible and actually monopolizing a 1,000-year-old trade network are very different challenges. That's where the violence comes in. The Portuguese couldn't compete with Muslim merchants on price or volume. Arab and Indian traders had centuries of relationships, networks, infrastructure. They knew the markets, they spoke the languages. They could move larger volumes of spices more efficiently than the Portuguese ever could through market forces alone. So Portugal didn't use market forces. They used cannons. Portuguese strategy was simple and brutally effective. Capture key choke points like Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz. Sink any ship carrying spices that didn't have Portuguese authorization. Force Asian producers to sell exclusively to Portuguese merchants at Portuguese prices. Anyone who resisted got burned alive on their own ships as a warning. This wasn't piracy. Pirates steal cargo. The Portuguese destroyed it. They would capture a ship full of valuable spices, take the money and cargo, then burn the ship and kill the crew. Not for the loot, for the terror. They wanted Muslim merchants to understand that trading without Portuguese permission meant death, not just financial loss. The goal was to make the traditional spice routes so dangerous that they collapsed entirely, forcing all trade through Portuguese-controlled sea routes around Africa. And it was working. By 1510, spice shipments through the Red Sea had dropped by 60%. By 1515, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt was facing economic crisis because the commerce that had sustained Cairo for centuries was being redirected around the Cape of Good Hope. And Albuquerque believed he had figured out how to do exactly that. His plan was so audacious, so absolutely insane, that when he first proposed it to King Manuel in 1510, the king thought he was joking. He wasn't. The plan had 4 phases, and each one was more ambitious than the last. Phase 1. Capture Aden, the fortress city at the mouth of the Red Sea. This would give Portugal control of the maritime gateway to Mecca. Without Aden, no Christian fleet could safely sail up the Red Sea. With Aden, the holiest cities of Islam would be vulnerable to naval attack for the first time in history. Phase 2. During Hajj season, when hundreds of thousands of pilgrims would be in Mecca, sail a war fleet up the Red Sea to Jeddah, the port city closest to Mecca. Jeddah was only 40 miles from Mecca, close enough to march an army before anyone could organize a defense. Phase 3. Sack Mecca, slaughter the pilgrims, and completely demolish the Kaaba. Not just damage it, level it, scatter the stones, salt the earth, make sure it could never be rebuilt. The Portuguese would film themselves doing it if cameras existed. They wanted the entire Muslim world to know that their holiest site had been destroyed by Christians. Phase 4, and this is where the plan crosses from horrifying into cartoonishly evil. March inland to Medina, where the Prophet Muhammad was buried, dig up his body, and take it back to Portugal as a trophy. They would hold it hostage and demand that the Ottoman Sultan hand over Jerusalem in exchange for the Prophet's remains. I need you to understand, this wasn't a drunken tavern conversation. This was an official military proposal, written down, sent to the King of Portugal, seriously debated by the Royal Council. Multiple versions of the plan survive in Portuguese archives. Albuquerque didn't just want to strike a blow against Islam. He wanted to break it so completely that it would never recover. And the craziest part? He had a backup plan that was somehow even more ambitious. If attacking Mecca directly proved too difficult, Albuquerque proposed diverting the Nile River. Not damming it, diverting it, changing its course so that Egypt would starve. He had engineers draw up plans for massive earthworks that would redirect the Nile's flow away from Cairo and Alexandria. The idea was to destroy the Ottoman Empire's breadbasket, trigger mass famine, and force the Sultan to sue for peace. He calculated that without Egyptian grain, the Ottomans would collapse within 2 years. This is the Renaissance equivalent of proposing nuclear warfare. Albuquerque was talking about causing millions of deaths through deliberate famine to achieve a military objective. And he wasn't dismissed as a lunatic. King Manuel seriously considered both plans and gave Albuquerque permission to proceed with the Mecca operation, if the opportunity presented itself. To understand why Portugal was willing to go this far, you need to understand what was happening in Europe in the early 1500s. The Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Iberia from Muslim rule, had just ended in 1492. For 781 years, Christian kingdoms in Spain and Portugal had been in a state of permanent holy war against Islamic states on their own peninsula. That's not an exaggeration. For over 7 centuries, the defining feature of Portuguese and Spanish identity was fighting Muslims. Then in 1492, Granada fell. Last Muslim kingdom in Iberia surrendered. After nearly 800 years, the crusade was won. Except the crusaders didn't go home. They took their ships, their religious fervor, and their accumulated experience in religious warfare and exported it to 3 continents. Christopher Columbus sailed west to find a route to Asia that bypassed Muslim lands. Vasco da Gama sailed south around Africa for the same reason. In both cases, the goal wasn't just trade. It was to outflank Islam geographically and attack it from directions where it was vulnerable. The age of discovery was the Reconquista going global, and Portugal, despite being tiny, was winning. By 1513, they controlled the sea routes around Africa. They had conquered key ports in India and East Africa. They had established dominance over the Indian Ocean spice trade. Albuquerque had personally led successful sieges of Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz, 3 of the most heavily fortified cities in Asia. He was on a winning streak that seemed unstoppable. So when he turned his attention to Mecca, it wasn't a fantasy. It was the logical next step in a campaign that had been succeeding beyond anyone's wildest expectations. If a Portuguese fleet could appear in the Red Sea during Hajj, who would stop them? This brings us to phase 1 of the actual operation, capturing Aden. Because without Aden, nothing else was possible. Aden sits on a volcanic peninsula at the mouth of the Red Sea, surrounded by ancient black stone walls built into the cliffs themselves. It had never been taken by naval assault in recorded history. The fortress had withstood sieges by Persians, Romans, and Ottomans. The harbor entrance was narrow, heavily fortified with cannons, and defensible by a relatively small garrison. It was the Red Sea's lock, and the Mamluks of Egypt held the key. Albuquerque attacked Aden in March 1513 with 20 ships and 1,500 soldiers. His plan was to bombard the harbor fortifications, land troops under cover of naval gunfire, and storm the walls before the defenders could organize a response. Portuguese artillery could shatter medieval fortifications. Their arquebusiers could mow down unarmored troops. And most importantly, their ships gave them mobility that no land-based power could match. They could appear anywhere along the coast, strike hard, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. The attack was a disaster. Not because the Portuguese weren't good at siege warfare, they were. Albuquerque had taken stronger cities than Aden. The problem was that the Mamluks had been preparing for exactly this attack for 3 years. They knew the Portuguese were coming. They knew what Portuguese tactics looked like, and they had turned Aden into a killing ground. When Albuquerque's ships entered the harbor, they found themselves in a crossfire. The Mamluks had positioned cannons on the heights overlooking the harbor mouth, creating a deadly funnel. Portuguese ships that sailed close enough to bombard the walls came under fire from positions they couldn't effectively target. The cannon emplacements were built into the volcanic rock cliffs, protected by natural stone overhead. Portuguese ships had to expose their broadside to fire, making themselves vulnerable to Mamluk counter-battery fire from protected positions. Ships that stayed at safe distance couldn't bring their guns to bear on the fortifications. The harbor was shaped like a crescent, with high walls on both sides. To hit the main fortifications, ships needed to sail deep into the harbor mouth, exposing themselves to fire from multiple angles. The Mamluks had done their homework. They understood Portuguese naval tactics and had designed their defenses specifically to counter them. The Portuguese tried to land troops on the beaches outside the city to approach from an unexpected angle. This should have worked, landing troops outside the defended harbor, marching them around to attack the city from the landward side. This was exactly the kind of tactical flexibility that made Portuguese forces so effective elsewhere. But the Mamluks had cavalry waiting. Here's what you need to understand about fighting in full-plate armor on a beach. Portuguese soldiers wore 70 to 90 pounds of steel. In India, this had been an advantage. Indian soldiers typically wore lighter armor or no armor at all. A Portuguese soldier in full plate with a steel helmet and shield was effectively invulnerable to sword cuts and arrows. Portuguese forces had won battles in India where they were outnumbered 10 to 1 simply because their armor let them wade into enemy formations and kill with impunity. On the beaches outside Aden, that armor became a death trap. Portuguese soldiers trying to establish a beachhead were loaded down with armor, weapons, supplies. They were moving slowly, struggling through sand and surf, trying to form defensive positions. Mamluk cavalry charged down from the hills at full speed, hitting the Portuguese while they were still disorganized and vulnerable. The cavalry didn't try to fight in sustained melee. They hit, killed who they could reach, and wheeled away before the Portuguese could form up. Then they charged again and again. They used the volcanic rock fields as cover, appearing from behind outcroppings, hitting Portuguese soldiers who were isolated or struggling with the terrain, then disappearing before Portuguese firearms could be brought to bear. Portuguese soldiers who made it off the beach found themselves fighting in volcanic rock fields, where cavalry had every advantage and infantry had none. The rocks were sharp, irregular, difficult to move through in armor. Footing was treacherous. Lines of sight were broken by rock formations. The Mamluk cavalry knew the terrain intimately. The Portuguese were fighting blind in an environment that negated every advantage they normally enjoyed. Albuquerque watched from his flagship as his landing force was systematically destroyed. He had 300 men on those beaches, and within 2 hours, half of them were dead or wounded. Survivors fought their way back to the boats under covering fire from the ships, leaving their dead behind. 2 ships were damaged by Mamluk artillery fire during the evacuation. One of them sank before it could clear the harbor. Albuquerque pulled back after losing 300 men and 2 ships. He retreated south to Socotra, a Portuguese base off the Horn of Africa, to regroup and reassess. This was the first major setback of his career. More importantly, it revealed a critical problem with the entire Mecca plan. The Portuguese didn't just need to capture Aden, they needed to capture it quietly. If word got out that Portugal was massing a fleet in the Red Sea, the Mamluks would fortify Jeddah. They would evacuate Mecca. They would rally every Muslim power from Morocco to Java to defend the holy cities. The whole plan depended on surprise and speed. Sail up the Red Sea, hit Mecca before anyone realized what was happening, and be gone before organized resistance could materialize. But they had just announced their presence with a failed siege of Aden. Every coastal lookout in the Red Sea was now watching for Portuguese sails. The element of surprise was gone. Albuquerque did the only thing he could do. He pivoted to the backup plan. In 1513, he dispatched a smaller fleet under Antonio de Saldana to raid the Red Sea coast and gather intelligence. The mission brief was explicit. Don't attack Mecca directly, but probe Jeddah's defenses. Map the coastline and assess whether a surprise attack was still feasible. If the answer was yes, Albuquerque would commit his full fleet the following year. During Hajj season, Saldana sailed north with 6 ships. His crews were Portuguese veterans who had fought in India and East Africa. They knew how to navigate hostile waters. They knew how to strike hard and disappear. And they were deeply committed to the mission on religious grounds. These weren't reluctant conscripts. These were men who genuinely believed they were doing God's work by preparing to destroy the Kaaba. As they sailed up the Red Sea in early 1514, they encountered something unexpected. Ottoman ships. Not Mamluk vessels from Egypt, but full Ottoman war galleys sailing south from Constantinople. This changed everything. The Ottomans had just conquered the Mamluks' Syrian territories in 1516, but even before that formal conquest, they were already extending their influence into the Red Sea. The Ottoman Sultan, Selim I, was a military genius who had spent the previous decade conquering everything in his path. He had defeated the Safavids of Persia, absorbed the Mamluk Sultanate, and turned the Ottoman Empire into the dominant Islamic power in the Middle East. More importantly for this story, Selim I understood exactly what the Portuguese were trying to do. He wasn't fooled by their trade rhetoric. He knew this was a religious war. And he knew that if Mecca fell to Christian forces during his reign, his legitimacy as the protector of Islam would be destroyed. So when Ottoman scouts reported Portuguese ships probing the Red Sea, Selim dispatched a war fleet with one mission: find the Portuguese and destroy them, not capture them, not negotiate, destroy them. The 2 fleets met off the coast of Yemen in April 1514. Saldana had 6 ships. The Ottomans had 12, but the Portuguese had better cannons, more experienced crews, and a significant advantage in firepower. In the age of sail, those factors usually decided battles before the fighting even started. The engagement lasted 6 hours. The Portuguese used their standard tactics: stay at range, use superior artillery to cripple enemy ships, then close for boarding once the enemy was disabled. The Ottomans tried to close distance and board Portuguese ships where their numerical advantage would matter. It should have been a Portuguese victory. It wasn't. The Ottomans had copied Portuguese ship designs and artillery. They had recruited European cannon founders, mostly deserters from Venice and Genoa, to create guns that matched Portuguese firepower. They had studied Portuguese tactics from previous engagements in the Indian Ocean, learning from losses and adapting. The Ottoman admiral commanding the fleet, a man named Selman Reis, had fought the Portuguese before and lost. He wasn't making the same mistakes twice. When the battle began, Saldanha expected the Ottomans to charge in immediately, trying to close distance for boarding actions. Instead, the Ottoman ships stayed at range and traded shots with the Portuguese, gun for gun, broadside for broadside. The Portuguese had slightly better accuracy and their crews were more experienced with naval gunnery, but the difference wasn't decisive. After 2 hours of long-range artillery exchange, both fleets had taken damage, but neither side had gained a clear advantage. Portuguese gunners had knocked down Ottoman masts and rigging, but Ottoman counterfire had damaged Portuguese hulls and killed crew. This wasn't how Portuguese naval tactics were supposed to work. They were supposed to dominate the artillery phase so completely that boarding actions became formalities. Salman Rice then did something clever. He split his fleet into 2 groups. 6 ships continued the long-range artillery duel with the Portuguese, keeping them engaged and focused. The other 6 ships used wind and current to maneuver around the Portuguese flank, threatening to get behind Saldanha's formation where they could rake the Portuguese ships with broadside fire into their vulnerable sterns. Saldanha had to respond to the flanking maneuver, which meant breaking his formation and maneuvering his ships to counter the threat. This is where the Ottoman numerical advantage started to matter. The Portuguese had 6 ships. They could form a coherent battle line or respond to the flanking maneuver, but not both simultaneously. Saldanha chose to keep his ships together, turning the entire formation to face the flanking threat. This opened up his original position to the 6 Ottoman ships that had been trading long-range fire. They immediately closed distance, trying to board the Portuguese ships that were now focused on the flanking group. Now the Portuguese were fighting on 2 fronts, with Ottoman ships closing from multiple angles, and the tactical situation had gone from favorable to desperate in minutes. Portuguese crews fought like demons. Arquebusiers on the decks fired into boarding parties trying to scale the ship's sides. Swivel guns loaded with grape shot swept Ottoman decks at close range. Portuguese marines fought hand-to-hand with Ottoman janissaries who made it onto Portuguese decks. The fighting was brutal, close range, chaotic. This was exactly the kind of battle the Portuguese had wanted to avoid. After 6 hours, with 3 Portuguese ships damaged and 2 Ottoman vessels sinking, both fleets disengaged. Saldanha's ships were still combat capable, but they had taken heavy casualties and expended most of their ammunition. The Ottoman fleet was bloodied, but still had numbers on their side. Neither commander wanted to risk everything on a decisive action. Saldanha limped south, back toward Portuguese bases in East Africa. The Ottoman fleet returned to Jeddah to fortify the harbor. No clear winner, but the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The Portuguese now knew that the Red Sea wasn't an undefended waterway they could sail up at will. The Ottomans had force projection in exactly the area where Portugal needed a free hand. Any attack on Jeddah would face opposition from an Ottoman fleet that could match Portuguese ships gun for gun. More problematically, the Mamluks in Egypt now knew with absolute certainty that Portugal was planning something major in the Red Sea. They began fortifying every port along the coast. They stationed troops in Jeddah permanently. They sent messengers overland to Mecca warning of potential Christian attack. The entire premise of the operation, surprise and speed, was now impossible. Albuquerque received the report from Saldanha in late 1514. He was in Goa, already sick with the malaria that would kill him within a year. He read about the Ottoman fleet, the fortifications going up in Jeddah, the lost element of surprise, and made a calculation. The Mecca operation was still theoretically possible, but it would require a much larger fleet, heavier commitment of troops, and, crucially, permission from King Manuel to divert resources from Portugal's campaigns in India and East Africa. He wrote to the king making his case. The letter survives in Portuguese archives. In it, Albuquerque argues that destroying the Kaaba would be worth any price. He estimates that a successful attack would demoralize the entire Muslim world, potentially trigger civil wars between Sunni and Shia factions over who failed to protect the holy cities, and allow Portugal to dictate peace terms to the Ottomans from a position of absolute religious and moral superiority. He also makes a more practical argument. Portugal's position in the Indian Ocean depended on controlling the spice trade. The spice trade depended on Muslim merchants not having alternative routes. If Portugal could close the Red Sea permanently by capturing Aden and Jeddah, they could force all spice traffic around the Cape of Good Hope on Portuguese-controlled routes. The Mecca operation wasn't just a religious crusade. It was a monopoly enforcement strategy. King Manuel read the letter and made a decision that would determine the fate of Islam's holiest site. He said yes. Not a cautious yes, not a proceed if the opportunity arises. A full-throated, commit the resources, make this happen yes. In 1515, Manuel authorized Albuquerque to assemble a fleet of 30 ships and 4,000 soldiers for a major operation in the Red Sea. The mission was explicit in the royal orders: capture Aden, establish Portuguese control of the Red Sea approaches, and, if God grants the opportunity, strike at the dwelling place of that false prophet. They were going after Mecca. This was happening. Then Albuquerque died. In December 1515, the malaria that had been weakening him for months finally killed him. He was 62 years old, one of the most successful military commanders of his generation, and he died before he could lead his final crusade. His successor as governor of Portuguese India was Lopo Soares de Albuquerque, a competent administrator but not a warrior like Albuquerque. Albuquerque read the same royal orders authorizing the Red Sea operation, looked at the same fleet being assembled, and made a completely different assessment. The plan was too risky, the Ottomans were too strong, the logistics were too complex, the consequences of failure were too severe. If a Portuguese fleet sailed up the Red Sea and got destroyed, it would cripple Portugal's position in the entire Indian Ocean. The Ottomans would go on the offensive. Allied sultanates in India and Southeast Asia would rebel. Everything Portugal had built in Asia over the previous 15 years could collapse. Albuquerque canceled the operation. He redirected the fleet to reinforce Portuguese positions in Malacca and Hormuz. He sent a letter to King Manuel explaining that the Red Sea operation was postponed indefinitely pending better strategic conditions. King Manuel was furious. He wanted the operation to proceed, but he was also dying. Manuel, I of Portugal, died in December 1521 without ever seeing his crusade against Mecca launched. His successor, João III, had very different priorities. João wanted to consolidate Portugal's existing holdings, not launch risky new crusades. The Mecca operation was quietly shelved. But here's what you need to understand about how close this came to actually happening. Between 1513 and 1515, there was a 2-year window where Portugal had the capability, the authorization, the resources, and the strategic opportunity to attack Mecca. If Albuquerque had captured Aden on the first try, or if he had lived another year to lead the 1516 fleet himself, the attack would have proceeded. What would have happened if Portuguese ships appeared in Jeddah's harbor during Hajj with orders to destroy the Kaaba? We can make educated guesses based on other Portuguese operations in Asia. At Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz, Portuguese forces fought outnumbered and won through superior firepower, discipline, and ruthlessness. A force of 2,000 Portuguese soldiers with artillery support could absolutely take and hold Jeddah for the time it would take to march 40 miles inland to Mecca. Once in Mecca, the real question is whether they would have found the Kaaba defended or abandoned. If the Mamluks had time to evacuate the city and move pilgrims to safety, the Portuguese would have arrived to find an empty city. They could have demolished the Kaaba, but the symbolic victory would have been diminished if they couldn't also massacre the pilgrims. If the Portuguese caught Mecca by surprise during Hajj, you're looking at one of the great atrocities of history. Hundreds of thousands of unarmed pilgrims trapped in a desert city with no escape routes, facing professional soldiers with arquebuses and artillery. It would have been a slaughter that made the sack of Constantinople look restrained. The aftermath would have been seismic. The Ottomans would have declared immediate jihad against Portugal. Muslim powers from Morocco to Indonesia would have united against what they saw as Christian barbarism. The Portuguese position in Asia would have become untenable. You would have seen mass uprisings, diplomatic isolation, and quite possibly the collapse of Portugal's entire empire in the Indian Ocean. The religious and cultural impact would have been even more profound. The Kaaba isn't just a building. It's the physical and spiritual center of Islam. Muslims pray toward it 5 times a day from anywhere on earth. If it had been destroyed by Christians, the psychological trauma would have been incalculable. You would likely have seen religious warfare on a scale that would make the Crusades look like border skirmishes. Some historians argue that Islam would have survived the destruction of the Kaaba and emerged stronger through shared trauma and renewed religious fervor. Others suggest it might have fractured into warring sects, arguing over where to rebuild and who had failed in their duty to protect the holy sites. We can't know for sure. What we do know is that it would have changed the course of world history in ways we're still trying to map out. Here's where the story turns really dark. Even after the main operation was canceled, individual Portuguese commanders kept trying to attack Red Sea targets on their own initiative. In 1517, a Portuguese captain named Fernão Gomes de Lemos raided the Eritrean coast, not far from Jeddah. In 1520, another captain, Antonio Correa, sailed into the Red Sea with 4 ships and tried to attack a Muslim pilgrim convoy sailing from Egypt to Jeddah. He failed, but the intent was clear. These weren't rogue pirates. These were Portuguese officers acting on what they believed were Albuquerque's intentions, even though official policy had changed. The raids continued sporadically into the 1530s. By then, the Ottomans had fully conquered Egypt and established permanent naval presence in the Red Sea. Portuguese ships that ventured north of Aden were hunted and destroyed. The strategic window had closed. Mecca was safe. But we need to talk about what this reveals about the Age of Discovery as a whole, because this wasn't an aberration. This was the norm. The Portuguese tried to destroy the Kaaba. The Spanish conquistadors deliberately destroyed Aztec and Inca temples to break indigenous religions. The Dutch burned Indonesian villages that wouldn't convert to Christianity or sign trade monopolies. The British did the same thing in India. European expansion in the 16th and 17th centuries wasn't about trade or exploration. It was about religious warfare and cultural annihilation, dressed up in economic language. Albuquerque's plan to destroy Mecca was just the most audacious version of a strategy that European powers pursued on 3 continents for 200 years. The goal was never coexistence, it was domination and conversion by force. The Portuguese didn't want to trade with Muslim merchants. They wanted to destroy Muslim merchants and take their place. Didn't want diplomatic relations with Asian kingdoms. They wanted those kingdoms subordinated to Portuguese interests and converted to Christianity. This is why we don't make movies about Portuguese explorers the way we make movies about other historical figures. When you dig into the details, the heroes of the Age of Discovery were religious fanatics who made modern extremists look moderate by comparison. Vasco da Gama burned a ship full of Muslim pilgrims alive because he was irritated with their ruler. Pedro Alvarez Cabral bombarded Calicut and killed 3,000 civilians because trade negotiations moved too slowly. Afonso de Albuquerque proposed destroying the most sacred site in Islam and diverting the Nile River to starve millions of Egyptians. These weren't great men, they were war criminals with state backing. And here's the really uncomfortable part. It almost worked. Portugal came within a hair's breadth of fundamentally altering the religious landscape of the world. If Albuquerque had lived one more year, if Aden had fallen on the first attempt, if the Ottomans had been 6 months slower to project force into the Red Sea, we would live in a very different world. Legacy of this near miss is complicated. In Muslim historiography, the Portuguese threat to Mecca is remembered as the moment that proved the necessity of Ottoman expansion. The Ottomans didn't conquer the Mamluks just for strategic advantage. They did it because the Mamluks had proven incapable of defending the holy cities. Ottoman Sultan Selim I literally used the Portuguese threat as justification for his conquest of Egypt and the Hijaz. The Mamluks cannot protect Mecca, he told his critics. We can. In Portuguese historiography, Albuquerque is still celebrated as a hero. There are statues of him in Lisbon and Goa. Schools are named after him. His military genius is praised. The fact that he wanted to destroy the Kaaba is mentioned, if at all, as evidence of his religious devotion, rather than his extremism. Portugal has never fully reckoned with what its explorers actually did in the 16th century. The Kaaba still stands in Mecca. Every year, millions of Muslims perform Hajj, circling the Black Cube and praying toward the structure that Abraham supposedly built. They have no idea how close it came to being demolished by Portuguese crusaders with cannon and sword. The continuity of that ritual, unchanged from the 7th century to today, masks just how fragile it was in the early 16th century. And here's what haunts me about the story. Albuquerque wasn't crazy. He was rational, calculating, and very nearly successful. His plan to destroy the Kaaba wasn't a fantasy. It was a legitimate military operation with clear objectives, realistic tactics, and strong institutional backing. It failed because of a series of small contingencies. Aden's defenses held, Ottoman reinforcements arrived 6 months earlier than expected. Albuquerque got malaria at exactly the wrong time. Change any one of those variables, and you're reading a very different story. One where the Kaaba was destroyed in 1516, millions of Muslims were traumatized, the Ottoman Empire launched a holy war against Portugal, and the entire trajectory of Islamic-European relations went down a far darker path than what actually happened. This is why we study history, not to celebrate the past or feel good about human progress, but to understand how contingent everything is, how close we come to disaster, how often catastrophe is averted not by wisdom or morality, but by luck and timing. Portugal didn't refrain from destroying the Kaaba because they realized it was wrong. They refrained because Albuquerque died before he could do it. That's not a story about the triumph of civilization. That's a story about how thin the line is between history and catastrophe. So the next time you hear about the Age of Discovery being presented as this noble enterprise of brave explorers seeking knowledge and trade, remember Afonso de Albuquerque. Remember that he proposed destroying the most sacred site in Islam during the holiest week of the year while pilgrims prayed. Remember that his king approved the plan. Remember that Portugal assembled a fleet to do exactly that. Remember that it only failed because of accidents and contingencies, not because anyone in power thought it was morally wrong. And remember that the Kaaba is still standing not because the Portuguese wouldn't destroy it, but because they couldn't. There's a difference, and that difference matters.